Only 6% of China's sprawling 45,000-kilometer high-speed rail network turns a profit. The other 94% runs at a loss, contributing to a 6.2 trillion yuan, approximately $860 billion, debt pile for China's rail operator. By stark contrast, Japan's original bullet train line not only repaid its construction cost within a few years, it now generates over 1 trillion yen in revenue annually. In the world of fast trains, bigger isn't always better, and the numbers defy what you might expect. Let's set the stage on why this rail trap matters now. A decade ago, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, a global infrastructure push spanning 147 countries. Railways were a centerpiece. From Asia to Africa, China promised new tracks and bullet trains to boost trade. Over $1 trillion has already been poured into BRI projects, and total costs could reach as high as $8 trillion. The goal: connect the world and expand China's economic reach. But many of these projects came with heavy loans. The term debt trap diplomacy entered the lexicon. The idea that China's loans might leave poorer nations owing more than they could repay. In Laos, for example, a $5.9 billion China-built railway came at a price equivalent to 1/3 of Laos's GDP, pushing the small country's debt to precarious levels. Meanwhile, Japan has quietly been championing quality infrastructure. In 2015, Tokyo announced a $110 billion fund for high-quality Asian infrastructure, explicitly positioning itself as an alternative to China's BRI. Japan's overseas rail projects, like India's upcoming bullet train, emphasize low-interest financing and rigorous planning. The Japan-India deal is telling. 81% of the project's cost is funded by a Japanese loan at just 0.1% interest over 50 years. Japan frames its approach as sustainable and transparent, implicitly promising not to create debt traps. Why does this matter now? Because the bills are coming due. Many BRI host countries are starting to struggle with loan repayments in 2025, forcing tough negotiations, project delays, and even asset handovers in some cases. Simultaneously, China's own economy has slowed, making its trillion yuan rail debt harder to ignore. Essentially, we're at a crossroads. Will the world's biggest infrastructure spree pay off, or become a cautionary tale? And can Japan's model provide a better path? Japan's rail revolution began in the post-war boom. In 1964, Japan unveiled the Tokaido Shinkansen, the world's first high-speed railway, connecting Tokyo and Osaka. It was a bold bet, 380 billion yen, about $1 billion in 1964, to lay 515 kilometers of new tracks. Skeptics wondered if it would ever pay for itself. It did, and then some. The line was packed from day one, carrying 11 million passengers in its first year and over 100 million annually by the early 1970s. In fact, the bullet train became so popular that its revenue helped subsidize Japan's slower, rural lines for decades. By the 1980s, the Tokaido Shinkansen was extremely profitable, bringing in 1.07 trillion yen, or $10.5 billion, in revenue in 2013 alone. This success taught Japan a crucial lesson. High-speed rail could be an economic engine if built on the right corridor. Yet, Japan also learned the perils of overexpansion. In the 1970s and 80s, the national rail operator JNR built many new lines, some in less populated areas, and piled up huge debts. By 1987, JNR's debt had ballooned to over 27 trillion yen, a burden the government could no longer sustain. The result was a dramatic reform: privatization. JNR was split into regional companies, the JR Group, a process guided by the 1987 JNR reform law. Crucially, the profitable core, like JR Central, operating the Tokyo-Osaka Shinkansen, was separated from money-losing lines. The JR companies were mandated to operate on commercial principles. Essentially, no profit, no new projects. This was a turning point. Japan's rails would henceforth be run as businesses, not public works. It imposed a hard financial discipline, but ensured that expensive boondoggles would be avoided. Meanwhile, China's rail journey took a very different track. Through much of the 20th century, China lagged in rail technology. It had a vast, low-speed rail network, but nothing like Japan's bullet trains. The seeds of change were planted in the early 2000s, when China began importing high-speed rail tech from Japan, France, and Germany. By 2008, China was ready to sprint. In response to the global financial crisis, Beijing launched a 4 trillion yuan stimulus focused on infrastructure. High-speed rail was the crown jewel of this stimulus. From virtually zero in 2007, China built 16,000 kilometers of high-speed lines by 2014, astonishing the world. Entire lines appeared in mere years. Beijing to Shanghai, 1,300 kilometers, opened in 2011. Beijing to Guangzhou, 2,200 kilometers, by 2012. China's Ministry of Railways, later restructured as the China Railway Corporation in 2013, had a singular mandate: build, build, build. Government regulations technically required new lines to meet cost-benefit standards, but local authorities were eager to cash in on the HSR boom. The central government often provided half the funding, with provincial governments covering the rest, frequently via local financing vehicles and bank loans. The result was the fastest rail expansion in history. At its peak, China was laying 5,000 plus kilometers of new track each year, roughly equivalent to building the distance from New York to London annually. From the start, China's approach treated high-speed rail as a nation-building tool. Lines were pushed into every province, even remote regions where few people rode the trains. The logic was partly political: integrate inland areas and spur development there, much like 19th century America did with railroads. The mechanism was straightforward. State-owned banks, like China Development Bank, lent vast sums to China Railway and local governments, often at low domestic interest rates, and bonds were issued to cover costs. Essentially, China was charging the projects to its national credit card, off the official government balance sheet, but ultimately backed by state banks. And because it was all in the family of state entities, immediate profitability took a backseat to rapid completion. Beijing's success at home soon turned outward. In 2013, President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, explicitly naming railways as a priority for connecting China with its neighbors. Chinese rail SOEs, having gained massive experience domestically, were unleashed globally. The financing model for BRI rail projects often mirrored China's domestic one. Big loans from Chinese banks, often collateralized by the project or guaranteed by the host government, and construction by Chinese companies. For example, in 2015, Indonesia solicited bids for a high-speed line. Japan offered a careful plan with an official loan guarantee. China countered with a loan that required no Indonesian government guarantee via the China Development Bank, and a promise to build faster. Seduced by these terms, Indonesia chose China to build what would become the Jakarta-Bandung HSR, now called Whoosh. The initial interest rate on the Chinese loan was around 2%, later rising to 3.4% for additional funds, far higher than Japan's near-zero rates. But the absence of sovereign liability was a key factor. Japan, seeing its rivals' growing influence, doubled down on its quality over quantity mantra. Japanese agencies like JICA and JBIC structured overseas rail deals with extremely low interest and long grace periods, but also tied procurement, meaning the projects had to use Japanese trains, signals, and expertise. The 2015 Partnership for Quality Infrastructure was effectively a policy to uphold certain standards: transparency, debt sustainability, environmental considerations, to contrast with what critics saw as China's blank check approach. In short, Japan's mechanism abroad was to make infrastructure appealing through generosity and reliability, albeit at a slower pace, while China's mechanism was to flood the zone with fast money and fast construction, accepting higher risk. At the midpoint of our story, the consequences of these divergent strategies started to surface, and the narrative took a sharp turn. By the late 2010s, whispers about China's debt trap diplomacy became loud warnings. The turning point often cited is Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. Though not a railway, it became a symbol. Sri Lanka, unable to service over $1.4 billion in Chinese loans, handed a 99-year lease on the port to a Chinese firm in 2017. This high-profile surrender sent shockwaves through capitals around the world, especially in Asia and Africa, where Chinese-financed railways were underway. Suddenly, countries began asking, Will our shiny new Chinese-built railway one day belong to Beijing if we can't pay up? China, for its part, vehemently denied harboring nefarious intent. And indeed, many economists noted that no deliberate trap was needed. Sometimes bad luck or poor planning was enough. But perception is powerful. In Malaysia, a newly elected government in 2018 froze the China-funded East Coast Rail link amid concerns over cost and debt, later renegotiating the price down by a third. In Kenya, the $4.7 billion Nairobi-Mombasa standard gauge railway, built with Chinese loans, was running far below ridership projections, requiring government subsidies to repay the loan, raising fears it could become another Hambantota. In Kenya's case, the asset at risk would be the Mombasa port revenues, which were collateral for the loan. Amid this, Japan and other G7 nations seized the moment. They promoted concepts like the Blue Dot Network to certify trusted infrastructure projects, and in 2019, the G20, with both Japan and China's agreement, adopted the Principles for Quality Infrastructure Investment. These principles emphasized debt transparency, life cycle cost assessment, and social and environmental impacts. It was a diplomatic way of saying we must avoid unsustainable projects. The fact that China signed on was a subtle admission that some BRI ventures had gone awry. For China's domestic high-speed rail ambitions, a reckoning was also at hand. The breakneck expansion couldn't continue unabated, not financially at least. In 2021, China's State Council, the top government body, issued a rare warning about rail debt. New regulations ordered a pause on building new HSR lines that were projected to have low usage. Specifically, routes expected to operate below 80% of capacity were to be put on hold. This was effectively Beijing pulling the emergency brake. After adding rail lines the way one might add bus routes, officials realized the debt was outrunning the benefits. By end of 2021, China Railway's liabilities hit 5.9 trillion yuan, 5% of GDP, and the system even recorded a 49.8 billion yuan net loss that year. A professor at Beijing Jiaotong University bluntly noted that the government cared more about using HSR to boost GDP and connectivity, and it doesn't care about debt repayment. But the math was catching up. This moment, when even Chinese authorities acknowledged the debt trap on their own balance sheet, is the fulcrum of our story. The age of unchecked rail expansion was over. Now came the age of reckoning. Now we face the outcomes of these two strategies, laid out side by side. In China, the immediate consequence of its rail boom is a paradox, an engineering marvel that operates at a loss. China's high-speed rail network surpassed 50,000 kilometers in 2025, eclipsing the rest of the world combined. It's an incredible feat. Gleaming trains now zip across China at 350 kilometers per hour, linking 93% of cities, over 500,000 people. The social benefits are real. Millions enjoy faster travel. Remote provinces are more accessible, and there's national pride in having the most advanced rail tech. China's newest trains can hit 400 kilometers per hour in tests. But financially, the rails are strained to the breaking point. Only about 6 out of 16 major high-speed lines in China are profitable, mostly those in densely populated coastal corridors. That's roughly 2,300 kilometers of profitable track out of approximately 45,000 kilometers. Everything else is cross-subsidized. The flagship Beijing-Shanghai line, for example, earns healthy profits, net 12.8 billion yuan in 2024, and charges up to 553 yuan, $75, a ticket. Yet even that fare is less than half of what Japan charges on the equivalent Tokyo-Osaka route, about $160. China deliberately kept ticket prices low nationwide to encourage ridership and affordability, but as one analyst pointed out, that means it's unlikely these projects will turn a profit in the short run. The bottom line, China Railway Corporation's debt has swollen to 6.2 trillion yuan, and annual interest payments alone measure in the tens of billions. To cope, China has had to implement damage control. In mid-2024, for instance, ticket fares on the busy lines were hiked by up to 20%, specifically to subsidize the underused lines. The railway operator also cut back train frequencies on lightly traveled routes, and even closed 20 newly built stations that turned into virtual ghost towns due to lack of passengers. These ghost stations, some in inland provinces like Anhui or Yunnan, stand as concrete reminders that if you build it, people might not come. It's a poignant image, brand new modern stations gathering dust because the local population is too sparse or too poor to fill the trains. However, it's not all doom for China's rails. The government is pivoting to freight and logistics to extract more value. Historically, China's HSR was passenger only, but the nation has ramped up conventional freight rail, including special freight services to Europe, leveraging BRI trade routes. In 2021, freight revenue for China Railway actually exceeded passenger revenue for the first time, 435.9 billion yuan versus 301 billion yuan, a sign that moving goods, not just people, is critical to its strategy. There's also the intangible payoff: regional development. Provinces with high-speed rail access have seen growth in domestic tourism and some businesses relocating to cheaper inland cities, which officials argue is a long-term return that doesn't show up on the railway's balance sheet. One columnist in China even urged the public to focus more on the high-speed network's social value than its commercial value. This captures China's perspective. The railways are a public good, almost a utility, and like highways or power lines, their value isn't solely in profit. The catch, of course, is that someone still has to foot the bill for operations and debt, and that someone is ultimately the Chinese state, and by extension, taxpayers. Now let's switch tracks to Japan's outcomes. Japan's high-speed rail system is minuscule compared to China's in length, about 3,000 kilometers of Shinkansen lines versus China's 50,000 kilometers. But in terms of usage and efficiency, Japan's network is a powerhouse. Prior to 2011, Japan's Shinkansen carried more passengers annually than China's HSR, despite being a fraction of the size. Even today, the Tokaido Shinkansen, Tokyo-Osaka, alone runs up to 16 trains per hour per direction, each with 1,300 plus seats nearly filled. It has never had a fatal accident in its 59-year history, a testament to Japan's safety standards. Financially, the core Shinkansen lines are profitable and form the backbone of the JR company's revenues. JR Central, for example, earns approximately 90% of its passenger revenue from the Tokaido Shinkansen line. The profits from these lines have allowed Japanese rail operators to continuously invest in upgrades, like new train models, better earthquake protection systems, without needing government bailouts. In short, Japan's cautious expansion, only building new Shinkansen lines where demand justifies it, has kept its high-speed rail financially sustainable. One could say Japan built just enough to cover key city pairs and support economic growth, but not so much that white elephants proliferate. That's not to say Japan's rail endeavors have been perfect. The country did face a debt trap of its own in the 1980s with JNR, as we discussed, and even after privatization, the government had to absorb a large portion of JNR's debt, over 20 trillion yen. Some of Japan's local JR companies still rely on subsidies for rural lines. And when Japan ventures abroad, it encounters new challenges. The Mumbai-Ahmedabad bullet train in India, Japan's flagship export project, is facing delays due to land acquisition problems and has gone over budget from $15 billion to around $17 to $18 billion. Critics in India question whether the ridership will meet optimistic forecasts, raising the spectre that even with a virtually free loan, the project might struggle financially if ticket sales disappoint. Japan counters that this project is about long-term transformation, kickstarting high-speed rail in a country of 1.4 billion people, and that their generous loan terms give India plenty of time, 15-year grace period, 50-year repayment, to realize those benefits. Here we see an interesting mirror of China's argument. Japan is willing to be patient and absorb risk on behalf of a partner country, trusting that the societal benefits outweigh immediate returns. The difference is, Japan can absorb that risk without jeopardizing its own fiscal stability, given the loan is a drop in the bucket of its ODA budget, whereas China's approach has seen China itself accumulate piles of debt. Comparing the two approaches head-to-head, a few key points emerge. First, scale versus sustainability. China built about 15 times more high-speed rail in a decade than Japan did in 5 decades. But Japan's smaller network is generally profitable, while China's is not. Second, speed versus quality. China won projects by building fast and cheaply. The Jakarta-Bandung HSR, for instance, was finished, albeit late, in about 8 years. Japan's proposals might take longer, but promise meticulous engineering. Third, financing terms. Chinese loans typically carry higher interest, often 2 to 3% range, and shorter maturities, whereas Japanese loans can be near 0% over half a century. Over time, those differences are enormous. A 3% loan can double the principal over 25 years from interest, while a 0.1% loan barely grows at all. This is why officials like those in Indonesia called their China-funded railway a potential financial time bomb. They see the interest clock ticking loudly. On the other hand, Chinese projects often come with fewer strings attached politically. If a country doesn't qualify for World Bank or Japanese aid due to governance or debt concerns, Chinese banks might still finance them, albeit at higher cost. So Chinese rail diplomacy gained traction in places others hesitated. A striking comparison unfolded in Indonesia. After the contentious Jakarta-Bandung high-speed project with China, Indonesia turned to Japan for a more conventional medium-speed rail upgrade from Jakarta to Surabaya, 750 kilometers. Japan won that deal in 2017. By 2020, Indonesia even floated the idea of merging the two projects, effectively having Chinese and Japanese consortiums work on linked parts of a rail network. It's early days, but this could be a preview of the future, cooperation instead of rivalry. In such a scenario, Chinese financing and construction might pair with Japanese project management and quality standards, potentially giving host countries the best of both. Whether that harmony is achievable remains to be seen. Geopolitical competition often gets in the way. But it's telling that Indonesia, having experienced both models, is trying to balance them. Finally, consider the human element of these consequences. On a gleaming Japanese Shinkansen, riders pay more, but enjoy reliability to the second. The operator enjoys healthy profits that ensure the service's longevity. On a Chinese bullet train in a remote province, riders marvel at the speed and cheap fare, but each trip is subsidized by the central budget. The station they depart from might be nearly empty on weekdays, with local vendors lamenting lower foot traffic than promised. In countries like Kenya or Laos, brand new railways are celebrated as modern miracles, until budget time, when officials scramble to find tens or hundreds of millions for the next loan payment. The rail trap can thus refer to different predicaments. China caught in a trap of its own making, massive domestic debt from overbuilding, or other nations potentially ensnared by the terms of Chinese loans. And interestingly, Japan, by avoiding the trap, sometimes finds itself left out of deals, as it initially was in Indonesia, because its cautious approach wasn't as immediately seductive. There is an opportunity cost to not taking risks. So, who's actually ahead in this race? Is it the country with more tracks, or the country with more profits? In pure network size and geopolitical influence, China undoubtedly leads. But in financial sustainability and perhaps goodwill, Japan holds an edge. The true consequences will play out over decades. Will China be stuck servicing debt for generations?